So here we are at Unit 7, the last unit, and we're looking at special issues facing nurses. These 4 articles, well, really 3 articles and a couple of sentences, all address different conceptions of the role that nurses should play and the relationship between nurses and doctors. And as you can see, it sort of evolves and expands over the course of the 4 readings. So the first reading is a very short reading from Sarah E. Dock, and it's around the beginning of the 20th century, and it expresses the traditional idea of the nurse. The nurse as a profession pretty much started with a person called Florence Nightingale, which is a wonderful name that we English people all know about. She's a famous figure, and she was a nurse, or she sort of developed the idea of a nurse during the Crimea War, which was a war that between Russia and England or Britain in the 19th century. Very bloody war. The Crimea has been in the news in the past few years because Russia annexed it back from Ukraine in this case. But I don't know why Britain and Russia had a war about the Crimea, but they did. And during that war, which was very brutal, Florence Nightingale developed the idea of nursing and, the role of nurse. So this was when medicine was sort of expanding and was able to help more and more people. More and more cures were being invented. And initially, the role of the nurse was basically as a doctor's assistant. So Sarah E. Dock, in her piece, The Relation of the Nurse to the Doctor and the Doctor to the Nurse, the title is almost longer than the excerpt we've got, she describes the nurse's role as like an intelligent machine that obeys the doctor without question. So I'll quote, "Obedience is the first law and the very cornerstone of good nursing." Obedience to the doctor, obviously. "No matter how gifted the beginning nurse may be, she will never become a reliable nurse until she can obey without question." So no backtalk. "The first and most helpful criticism I ever received from a doctor was when he told me that I was supposed to be simply an intelligent machine for the purpose of carrying out his orders." I think if a doctor tried that on these days, I hope he would get a very different reaction. But so the idea there is that the nurse shouldn't have an idea of her own. She's basically an extension of the doctor. Everything she does is because the doctor said to do it, and that there's no independent role for the doctor. And according to the introduction in this section, this idea was basically accepted right up into the 60s. So, for example, the 1965 International Code of Nursing Ethics still stated that the nurse is under an obligation to carry out the physician's orders intelligently and loyally, basically saying the same thing. But then a sort of sea change happened throughout the late 60s and into the 70s, a very revolutionary time, so that in the 1973 International Council of Nurses Code for Nurses, it said that the primary responsibility of nurses was to patients. So instead of being responsible directly to doctors to do what they said, now nurses' loyalties seem to have shifted, and they're supposed to be patients' advocates. Now, of course, in practice, this should overlap with the old role, because ideally the doctor is supposed to be representing the patient too. So, and the doctor is supposed to be the expert on medicine. So in helping the patient, the nurse should do what the doctor says in most cases. But it's interesting to note that the primary loyalty is now directly to the patient. So the primary responsibility of nurses was to patients, quotes, to those people who require nursing care, and instead of reminding nurses that they are under an obligation to carry out doctor's orders, it merely admonished them to sustain a cooperative relationship with co-workers in nursing and other fields. So that's sort of knocking doctors, physicians in general, down off their pedestal. And it suggests a distinctive role for nurses as patient advocate. Now, as I've already said, it's not clear why this would in practice be different from the original role of just doing what the doctor said, because supposedly the doctor is looking out for the patient too. But in one of the readings, the third reading, the Breier reading, she suggests an arena where there might be a genuine divergence between what the doctor wants and what the patient wants. And that is specifically end-of-life care, because doctors notoriously are paternalistic. This takes back to our very second unit when we were talking about paternalism versus autonomy. Doctors see it as their role to do what's best for the patient, and they also see themselves as the experts on what's best for the patient, because getting better is supposed they see as what's better for the patients, and they know how to ensure this. Whereas in cases like Breier's example of Mr. X, the patient decides that they don't want to try any more treatments, they've had enough, and they just want to be put into hospice care, and the doctors might push back, and the doctors will say, no, I'm sorry, I know better, what's better for you, and I'm not going to give up. We're going to go on and try another round of chemo. It's at that point where the nurse's role as patient advocate comes to the fore, and she needs to help the patient push back against the doctor if necessary. All right, so we'll look at that in a second. But probably the reading I'll spend the most time on, partly because it's the most traditionally philosophical, so there's more for me to get my teeth into, is the second reading, which is by Newton, Lisa Newton, in defense of the traditional nurse. So notice this is written in the very early 80s, and she's pushing back against what had sort of happened in the 70s, which was this idea that nurses were now autonomous of doctors. That is, they have their own distinctive role, and it could coincide with what the doctor wants, but it doesn't necessarily. So they've broken away, and they're no longer just assistants to doctors. They have their own code of ethics, they have their own distinctive role, and they don't have to just do whatever the doctor says. They're not just doctor's assistants. Newton is going to argue that would be bad if nurses became autonomous, became their own distinctive thing, and weren't doctor's assistants. So when she talks about the traditional nurse, she means the nurse as doctor's assistant. So that's the second reading. We'll look at that in detail. And then Breier suggests, focusing on end-of-life care, suggests this is one key area where it's appropriate that the nurse be a patient advocate, and this is an independent role for them. And then finally, Pavlish, Ho, and Rounkle, Carol Pavlish, Anita Ho, and Anne-Marie Rounkle, based on a study they did in a Rwandan refugee camp in Rwanda with refugees from the Congo. They argue that they take this idea that Breier defends, that nurses should be patient advocates, and argue that where Breier focuses on being an advocate for individual patients, treating each one individually, Pavlish, Ho, and Rounkle suggests that patient advocacy could be expanded, and in fact should be expanded, to advocate for groups and to in fact push for human rights. Now, this might seem like something that is beyond the scope of nurses' role, because nurses' role is supposed to be as part of healthcare. But what the authors of this article argue is that healthcare and human rights advocacy, particularly in spheres like refugee camps, are inextricably linked. You cannot adequately advocate for patients without advocating for their human rights, because the violation of their rights is undermining their healthy flourishing. And that so this might be seen as saying, look, in a setting like in America, it's easy to think that people's human rights are taken care of and that therefore their only needs are medical. And that's what you can focus on, and you can pick the distinctive medical needs of each individual person, so you advocate for them individually. But when you look at the world in general, it's not the case that most people's rights are protected, and the nurse's role as an advocate for the welfare of the patient cannot be carried out, or it would be stupid to try to focus on just, like their wounds or something like that, a particular medical problem. That's literally putting a band-aid on the problem, and that if you're going to care for the patients, you have to see the context they're in, and you have to take care of their broader and more basic needs first. So nurses' role as patient advocacy, according to this last reading, becomes even greater expanded than the original, than Breier suggests. So we see a gradual progression on the role, the distinctive role of the nurse. All right, so I'm not going to talk too much about Doc. I mean, I think it's self-explanatory. She just says that nurses have to obey without question and be like a robot extension of the physician. No will of their own, in other words. Intelligent machine means they don't have free will. They're not supposed to say, but wait a minute, doctor, what about this? Okay, so let's look at Newton, who defends something like the traditional role. And defends it against some criticisms. Okay. So there's several things going on in the Newton article, but a thread running through the Newton article is that she sees that there is currently, at the time she's writing in the early 80s, she probably wrote it in the late 70s, there's the traditional ideal of the nurse. Look at old films. Nurses are seen as skilled and gentle caregivers. And she talks at one point about the etymology of the word nurse. She says nursing literally means, like a wet nurse is somebody who cares for somebody else's children and literally suckles them like a mother. That's sort of the idea. That's where we get the traditional idea of a nurse, that they're basically a mother's substitute. And pushing against this view is the view of the nurse as an autonomous professional, somebody who has their own role, who isn't necessarily tied to a particular role of patient care. Now notice that already Newton seems to view the role of the nurse as patient-centered. So already it seems like, and in fact in the Newton article, in defending the traditional role of nurse, she actually separates herself from Doc because she doesn't see the traditional role of the nurse as simply being an intelligent machine. She sees a distinctive role for nurses, and this is what she sees as the traditional role of the nurse. And she says that if we lost this distinctive role, we would lose out. The hospital would become a moral monstrosity, she says at one point. So actually, in Newton's article, although she claims to be defending the traditional role of the nurse, she carves out a space that is distinctive to nursing. So she makes clear that there is a gap between medicine, carrying out medical care, which is the physician's job, and nursing. And it does look like her view of the traditional nurse is as patient-centered. So this is a little bit different from what Doc says. All right. Now, she does several things in this article. Let's go over them. First of all, she says that nursing is a role. And she compares this, this is a sort of sociological term, or it's used in sociology a lot. And she says, the term is originally taken from acting, like you talk about an acting role. So a role is if you talk about, think about the role of, I don't know, think of a character from a show, or the role of Jack in Titanic. And now that's a role that was played by Leonardo DiCaprio. I have to admit, I've never actually seen Titanic, so I'm winging it here. I do know that, spoiler alert, he dies. But anyway, Leonardo DiCaprio is associated with that role. But of course, if they remade it, somebody else could play it. And there would be certain things you would have to do to play Jack. There are certain things that are definitive of that role. Or, you know, the role of the husband in The Shining. That's obviously associated with Jack Nicholson. Probably that's why I thought of it. But somebody else could play it and do it distinctly. Or the role of the Joker. There you go. There's something that has been played distinctively by all sorts of different people, and they've interpreted in different ways. They brought their own flavor to it, but there's certain limitations. For example, the Joker can't be buddies with Batman, or that would ruin the role. So a role has its limitations. Each individual can bring their own flavor to it, but there are limits to it that you have to do. Okay, so she breaks roles down into 4 elements. Basically, you can think of these as a grid. There's image and ideal, and there's public and private. So there's public image, public ideal, private image, and private ideal. And a public image is how the public views the role. So the public image of nursing is the general conception of what a nurse is. If you go to the average person and say, what is a nurse like? What they'll tell you is the public image. The private image of the nurse is how the role is understood by the role occupant, what it's really like. So if somebody has been a nurse for a while and hates it, then that will be a negative image. They will say like it's drudgery or something. Contrast this with the ideal. The ideal is how the role should be, whether or not it is. So the public ideal would be the conception of the perfect nurse in the minds of the public, and the private ideal is what nursing should be like. Okay, once you have those distinctions, she says you can... Clearly she's writing in a time when, as we saw, the view of nursing is changing. And there is this push to have nurses be more autonomous. And she calls this push the issue of autonomy. And she says there are 3 basic versions of how this issue of autonomy arises. So there's this time of upheaval where people are saying nursing should change. And she says there's 3 versions of why. 3 places that people are coming from to argue that nursing should change. So the first one, she says, is the first interpretation of this problem is that there is a clash between the public image of nurses as ill-educated and incapable of assuming responsibility. And this clashes with the nurse's self-image as the nurse's self-image or private image as competent professionals. So on this version, it's a clash between images. The public sees the nurses as incapable of autonomy, and the nurses themselves see themselves as capable. Obviously, the nurses know better, so what's got to happen, according to this view, is the public needs to be educated, and then we'll solve the problem, and we'll bring the 2 images into line. Now notice, this isn't Newton arguing this. This is her describing what she thinks is going on in the general zeitgeist, how the issue of autonomy is arising. The second version of this, she says, is a clash between a private ideal and a private image. That is, the private image is how the nurse sees themselves, and their ideal is separate from the image. So they say nursing is in fact like this, but it should be like this. She says, again, the private image, the private ideal is the autonomous professional, and the private image is nurses are kept under the thumb of hospital bureaucracies and not allowed to exercise their autonomy. So here, what the argument is that the actual situation of nurses is bad because of hospital hierarchies, because doctors view nurses as intelligent machines, when in fact nurses have all this potential, and we should change nursing so that the image and the ideal are the same. The image is brought to the ideal. But this is going to require a reform of the power structure of the healthcare industry, because the healthcare industry is invested in keeping nurses in this subordinate role. The third version of this issue of autonomy is a struggle between the private and the public ideal. So the private ideal is, again, just like before, an autonomous professional. So nurses say we should be given our own distinctive role, whereas the public ideal is that we want nurses to be the caring, docile figures that they've always been, or that we've always imagined them to be. We want them to be people who just soothe our fevered brow and change our bedpans, and that's it. We don't want them to be social advocates or anything like that. We want them to be caregivers. Whereas the private ideal is they want to do more than that. They want, they see that as oppressive. And this, if this is the problem, then the solution is, in quotes on page 702, the nurse needs primarily to gather allies to defeat the powerful interest groups that impose the traditional ideal for their own unworthy purposes. All right, so there are three versions of the problem. And what Newton says is that they all share in common this idea that the solution is for the nurse to become autonomous. But, and what they share in common is that the solution is for them to become autonomous, and they also share in common that the goal is to banish forever from the hospitals and the public mind that inaccurate and demeaning stereotype of the nurse as the lady with the bedpan, an image of submissive service, comforting to have around and skillful enough at her little tasks, but too scatterbrained and emotional for responsibility. So here she's saying this is what feminist critics of the traditional nurse are saying. And what she's going to argue in this article is that, first of all, traditional nursing shouldn't be viewed in this negative light because it is a valuable thing in its own right, and that actually for nurses to become autonomous would be bad because the traditional nursing role is important, and it's a vital part, a distinctive and vital part of patient care. And if nurses all became autonomous, we would lose this special thing that we need. So that's what she's going to argue. So she's going to argue that all of these three versions of the problem of autonomy are making the same mistake, which is to discount the value of the traditional caregiver role. Okay, so how's she going to argue for that? Well, she's going to take it from 3 points of view. She says there are three aspects, 3 points of view from which you can look at nursing. And in every one of those three, there is a vital need for the traditional nurse. And the three are, 1, the hospital as a bureaucracy, 2, medicine as a field of scientific endeavor and service, and 3, patient needs. And they all share in common a need for a traditional nurse. So first, the hospital is a bureaucracy. On page 703, she says this: the hospital's very nature demands that workers perform the tasks assigned to them, report properly to the proper superior, avoid initiative, and adhere to set procedures. Because basically the hospital is like a well-oiled machine. It's got a goal, curing patients, And it's only going to work if the people who know what to do, the doctors, get help. And the help can't be slowing them down. It can't be questioning them. That will just gum up the works. Since the stakes are too high to permit a gamble, the institution's effectiveness, not to mention its legal position, may depend on unquestioning adherence to procedure. Now this makes it sound like she's got Doc's view of the nurse as an intelligent machine. So that's the hospital as bureaucracy. The second one is medicine as a field of scientific endeavor and service. She says, if we're going to expand medicine or advance in medicine or deliver medicine to the patient, medicine depends on esoteric knowledge. That means knowledge that only a few people have, the experts, which takes time to acquire. That's the doctor's training. And which is rapidly advancing. New things are being learned all the time, which is why physicians have to keep going to conferences and reading medical journals, because they have to keep up with changing medicine. Thus, when a serious medical situation arises without warning, only physicians will know how to deal with it, and they will not always be able to explain or justify their actions to non-physicians. So again, this suggests like nurses shouldn't be pushing back against the doctors because nurses don't know. So again, this sounds a bit like Doc's view that that nurses should be like intelligent machines and just extensions of the doctors. And the overlap between the hospital as a bureaucracy and medicine as a field of scientific endeavor, in both cases, they're devoted to the saving of life and health, and that the atmosphere is tense and urgent, like everything's happening at once. You know, people are dying, we've got to get things done. And the third overlap is to achieve the objective, everyone must be on the same page, and the person who should be in charge is the doctor. So everybody should just do what the doctor says. So that's the first two elements. Now the third element that she spends a lot more time on is patient needs. And here she says the patient needs first specialized care, but second emotional support. And she refers to the patient as he. This is slightly old-fashioned, where it's assumed that unless someone is... It is assumed that you refer to the average individual as he, and she makes a point of saying, well, I'm not going to do this for nurses because most nurses are female, but the patient apparently are all male. So the patient needs reassurance, comfort, someone to talk to. The first job of the nurse is to be a mother surrogate. Now, I don't know about you. Maybe this reflects a problem on my part, but I found all this a little bit creepy. However, what she's saying is a patient, when they're vulnerable, when they're sick, becomes like a child. They can't take care of themselves. So it's as if they're thrown back to the stage where none of us can take care of ourselves, which is childhood. And then you have this biological urge to be near your mother, she says, and you need someone to act like a mother towards you when you're sick. And she says support for this view of the nurse comes from the etymology of nursing. And she goes into dictionary definitions and all that. Now, she does say, having said that, there are limits to the mother role, because one of the features of your mother is that she, particularly when you're a small child, is that she has complete authority over you. And that can't be the case anymore because when we're talking about patients as adults, because they are autonomous, they are free beings, and it is wrong to boss them around, to take away all their independence as you do with a small child. So she says, maternal authority, which is total, diffuse, and unlimited, would be incompatible with the retention by the patient of moral freedom. This is autonomy, freedom to choose what you want to do with your life. To prevent serious threats to patient autonomy, then, the role of the nurse must be from the outset as essentially as it is nurturing, I think that should be, unavailable for such attributions of authority. That is, so the nurse only has the nurturing elements of motherhood. She doesn't have the authority of motherhood. Not only must the role of the nurse not include authority, it must be incompatible with authority, essentially a subservient role. So the argument is a little quick here. Basically it says that nurses have to protect patient autonomy. And actually this isn't something that Breier is going to take and run with. That yes, nurses really do have to protect patient autonomy. And this, Breier argues, is going to require pushing against doctors in certain instances, like with end-of-life care. But Newton argues that to protect the autonomy of the patient, you can't take over the complete mother role, which is bossing them around. You just have to care for them. Furthermore, actually, Newton talks about cases of where the patient is dying too, where patients and their families have human and emotional needs. The hospital system must somehow be able to share pain and grief as well as it makes medical judgments and keeps records. The traditional nurse's role addresses itself directly to these human needs. Its derivation from the maternal role classifies it as feminine and permits ready assumption of all attributes culturally typed as feminine: tenderness, warmth, sympathy, and a tendency to engage much more readily in the expression of feeling than in the rendering of judgment. Without the nurse role in this function, the hospital becomes a moral monstrosity. Only the nurse makes the system morally tolerable. So basically she says, here's what's distinctive about nursing. So the first two stages of her argument, she argues that nurses have just got to do what doctors says, the hospital bureaucracy and medicine as a scientific endeavor. But when she's talking about patient needs, there is some patient needs that they have that doctors cannot satisfy. Doctors are not around much. Doctors have to be focused on medicine as a procedure. Doctors are like mechanics fixing a car, and they don't have time to regard the car as if it has feelings. But of course, patients are human beings. They do have feelings, and they have distinctive emotional needs, particularly if they're very sick and they're dying. And that's the nurse's role. The nurse's role is to care for the emotional needs of the patient. And that's something a doctor cannot do. And if nurses become autonomous, Newton is saying, they'll be off trying to become little doctors. And then we'll have no one to do this important role. You have to be like a subservient, gentle, kind, tender individual who just sort of babies patients. And that's something doctors can't do, and that's something, if nurses become autonomous, they won't be able to do, they won't have the time to do. So for hospitals to serve patients, you must have people who do this, and those are nurses. And that's the traditional role of the nurse, is to be like an angel at the bedside. So, in summary, the ideal of autonomy for nurses would be bad, because we need nurses not to be autonomous to play the vital role of nurturing in an otherwise cold environment, and also to obey without question to make hospitals function. So there's sort of two prongs to our argument. In order to make hospitals do their job to save, basically to save the lives, to deliver medicine, you got to do what the doctor said. But there's also this thing that the doctor can't do, which is care for the emotional needs, and nurses have to do that too. And that's the traditional role, not this autonomous individual that the feminists are arguing for. Finally, she says, let's look at feminist criticisms directly, because it's partly feminist. It's no accident that the view of nursing changed in the 60s and 70s when feminism was in a particularly active phase. And the feminist criticisms of the traditional nursing role, they're basically two. The first one is that you can't quash the autonomy of nurses and because otherwise you'd be doing you would be reinforcing something like what slavery does. So slavery, and to a lesser extent the traditional role of housewife, which is also a subject of feminist criticism, are bad because they are roles that take away the autonomy from the people occupying them. This is obvious in the case of a slave. Slaves don't have autonomy. They're not in control of their fate. They're not allowed to do what they want. But also housewives. Housewives basically had no money. Right up until the 70s, women weren't allowed to get their own credit cards. You had to be in a very distinctive position, and married women were prevented from having particular jobs. My mother, for example, was barred from being a teacher because she was married. She was working overseas at the time, overseas from England. So, housewives were very restricted roles. They didn't have their own money. They were given an allowance by their husbands that the husbands could control. They had to do certain things like keep the house clean and cook meals for their husbands. It was very restrictive, and feminists were rejecting this. So the feminist critique of the housewife role and the everyone critique of the slavery role is being applied to nursing. In that, nurse, traditional nurse, like housewife and slave, are all roles that oppress their occupants and deny their autonomy. Now Newton responds to this and says, no, there's something different between slave and housewife and nurse. Slave and housewife are life roles. That is, they're roles that you can't get out of. They define your every moment. They're what control your life. Whereas nurse is just a job. And you only do it while you're on the job. You go home, there's no rules. You can do what you want. So yes, she's saying the traditional nurse is a restrictive role in many respects. But of course, you could like those respects. Maybe that's what you like to do. And she says she hopes that there are many people who like to care for patients in an emotional way. And for them, they won't feel it restrictive. And besides, when they get home, they can do what they want. So what was bad about the slave and the housewife is that their life roles, and that's inescapable. Nurse is an occupational role. You can leave it at the end of the day. Now, I'm sure a feminist would not be happy with that. It's, because your job is such an important part of who you are, it shouldn't be the case that it's subservient, but that's her response. The second feminist criticism that she considers is that the traditional nurse role is harmful to society because it preserves harmful sexist gender roles. It's certainly true that nurses are, there's bizarre kind of sexual fetishes around nurses. Less true now when nurses wear scrubs, but certainly if you look at old movies, nurses dressed in these little outfits with little hats and little skirts, and they were seen as kind of sexy, which, if you combine it with their mother roles, is again something you don't want to think about. It's a little queasy. But there's this idea that it is a very feminine role, and that nurses are supposed to be very feminine, and therefore I think this is why they were stereotyped as kind of sexy, because they're so feminine. But also subservient, which is the negative side of the traditional idea of femininity. And so if nurses are out there as a job, they set a bad example to society, and they make, like the traditional secretary as well. This is another target of feminist criticism, that they teach people in the culture at large, this is what women are like, and the subservient aspect of it means that people view women as necessarily subservient, and it hurts all women and all men, because they don't get to have equal relationships with women. Now Newton's response is basically to say, well, this is only a criticism if you internalize the traditional gender roles. So for example, if you think that tenderness is feminine, then you will see the nurse as essentially feminine. But we should not see that way. And in fact, so she's sort of taking another feminist goal, which is to, and this is one particular wave of feminism, which is to argue that women are not necessarily sensitive and men are not necessarily insensitive, that gender roles have oppressed people of both sexes and forced all men to sublimate their feelings when in fact they might be emotional, when men might cry, and if they hadn't been taught that crying is weak and girly, and women might be more powerful if they hadn't been forced to be submissive. And Newton says, yeah, I agree. One of the most damaging mistakes of our cultural heritage is the assumption that warmth, gentleness, and loving care, which she insists are part of nursing, such as are expected of the nurse, are simply impossible for the male of the species, and that for men to show emotions, men that show emotion are weaklings or sissies. In the words of the current feminist movement, men must be liberated as surely as women, and one of the best avenues of such liberation would be the encouragement of male participation in the healthcare system in roles like the traditional nursing role. So she says, if we had more male nurses, then nobody would think that nurses represent some kind of ideal of femininity, and therefore they wouldn't be oppressive to women, because they wouldn't think that that's what women should be like. Because if you have men and women both being nurses, then you don't say, the nurse is what a woman should be like, because there's just as many men. So what she's saying is, look, I'm just saying that there are certain jobs that require you to be gentle and loving and kind, and nursing is one of them. I'm not saying that that's what women are like, although she did, of course, earlier in the article say that she acknowledged that there are the traditional, yes, as she said on page 705, the traditional nurse's derivation from the maternal role classifies it as feminine and permits ready assumption of all attributes culturally typed as feminine. Now, she says culturally typed. She doesn't say that they're essentially feminine, but she's acknowledging that. And of course, her tying it to the mother rather than the father is kind of a giveaway. She seems to be suggesting that mothers are essentially loving and kind. So I'm not sure what the feminist would buy that, but it's certainly something that feminists have pushed for, more male nurses. So basically she's saying, look, we need people to be gentle and kind. I don't care if they're men or women, just we need people to care for patients' feelings. All right. But of course, the other part of our article does insist, as Doc insisted, that nurses should just do what doctors say. Breier is going to agree with Newton that nurses should advocate for patients, and both of them focus on end-of-life care, where there are particular emotional needs for the patient and their families. But she's going to argue that this is actually going to lead to independence from the doctor. In other words, the nurse shouldn't necessarily fight with the doctor. Breier doesn't argue that. She just says that where the patient disagrees with the doctor, the nurse shouldn't side automatically with the doctor. And she begins the article, this is Breier, with the Mr. X scenario, where Mr. X has all kinds of things wrong with him, and doctors keep wanting to try these treatments, and it leads to horrible pain, and in the end Mr. X dies very quickly, when the patient and his family would have preferred that he go into hospital care, and he would have had a longer time to die, and not so painfully, and not in the hospital setting. So the family were left feeling cheated, that they were denied a chance to say goodbye in a better environment of the hospice, because doctors insisted on trying medical treatments that the patient didn't want. Okay, quote, page 710. Patients who are confronted with the autonomy/paternalism dichotomy. Autonomy is them getting to do what they want. Paternalism is where the doctors say, no, we know what's good for you, you're going to do this. Are often unable to verbalize their needs or wants to the doctors, either because they're intimidated by the doctor's perceived power or because the doctors lack the time to listen to their concerns. Nurses, however, as patients' advocates, are ideally positioned to assist the patients and their families to clarify their needs and desires. So again, doctors have to go from patient to patient and patient. They don't have time to get involved in their care. Nurses, however, because there's many more of them and because they don't have to spend so much time in medical school, they're available to listen to the patients, and that should be their role. So nurses are in a unique position to initiate discussions regarding patients' preferences for treatments and quality of life. The intent of such nurse-driven negotiation is to ensure that everyone works together to secure the best possible outcome for the patient, not that any one person or party asserts their assumed authority. So Breier isn't arguing that nurses should have their own camp and say, no, we're going to fight with the doctors. It's not like in a court where you have the prosecution and the defense and they're adversarial. It's that the nurse has got to see the point of view of both the doctors and the patients, understand both of them, and advocate advocate for the doctors to the patient, say, here's why the doctor wants this treatment, what it'll do, and then once the patient says, no, I'm sorry, I get what he wants to do, and I don't want that, I just want to die, then the nurses have to advocate for those wishes to the doctors. Breier cites an ethnographic study that revealed the difference between doctors' and nurses' view of patient autonomy. The professional goals of nurses, according to nurses, is daily care and helping patients to live as normally and independently as possible. So that second one is ensuring patient autonomy, which again, remember, Newton said that's why nurses can't be bossy or mothers. They have to just have the nurturing side of motherhood. They can't have the authority role of mothers because we've got to ensure patient autonomy. So Newton and Breier appear to agree that that is an important role for nurses, to make sure to protect patient autonomy. But where Breier is stressing is that maybe we have to protect patient autonomy against doctors, which is not something that Newton really considered. Whereas doctors, when they were asked what their job is, and it's systematic problem solving, improving organ function, and research, all very clinical and cold, nothing about emotional needs or anything like that. So again, nurses do view themselves as having this much more caring role, and that's okay. So Breier is saying that yes, there is an important distinctive role. So there is a difference between nursing as a practice and medicine. Now this is something, of course, that Doc would seem to deny. Doc says that nurses are just machines to carry out the doctor's wishes, whereas Taylor, who is quoted by Breier, is saying, no, there's a distinctive difference. Nursing is a different job. So nurses, they've got to assess three things: the patient's current health state, the influence of that state on the person. Is the fact that the patient is sick in this way depressing the person, making them sad, making them hopeless? And third, its influence on the person's ability to achieve meaningful life goals. So, maybe if a doctor is saying, look, I can save your life, but, you're going to lose your sight or something like that, and the patient says, no, I'm an artist, I would rather have a few weeks of sight left and then die rather than go blind because my life is my visual art, then that's something that a nurse should take into account. So nursing because of nurses' distinctive role and their increased access to the patient, they can take the patient's point of view and advocate for them. So to summarize, on page 715, Breier says, to claim that patients have autonomy is to argue that they have the capacity and right to decide for themselves the values and rules that will govern their existence. And that's something that doctors can overlook, of course. They can just say, look, I know what's best for you. And they do, because they do know what's medically, they do know medicine when the patient doesn't. But the patient has a right to decide whether they're going to live or die, or whether they accept this treatment. So patients have the capacity and right to decide for themselves the value and rules that will govern their existence. This provides a justification for limiting the power that doctors can exercise over patients. Specifically, the power to judge and make decisions without their knowledge, understanding, or consent. Ultimately, granting doctors unilateral decision-making power on the basis of medical dominance would substitute a system of medical paternity, paternalism, for patient autonomy. Nurses can situate themselves realistically within this ever-present dichotomy, which is, butting heads between paternalism and autonomy, by assuming the role of patient advocate, thus embracing their own professional power via professional development. That is, nurses have a distinct professional role. They are nurses. They are trained in nursing, and that's something that doctors can't claim to be experts in. So they are independent. So in this case, Breier seems to be agreeing with Newton to a great extent that yes, there is a role for nurses as patient advocates, and they've got to care for patients' emotional needs. But this can also mean that nurses are autonomous. So there isn't necessarily an either-or that Newton saw between the autonomous role of the nurse and the traditional nurse. Nursing as a practice, because it is unique and distinctive, should grant nurses professional autonomy. By assuming the role of patient advocate plus embracing their own professional power via professional development within this area of clinical ethics. So doctors are not experts on ethics. This is worth repeating. Doctors are no more experts on ethics than nurses. Both of them have to take the same classes like this one on bioethics. And nurses, if anything, might be more expert on ethics to do with respecting patient autonomy because they know the patients more. So doctors shouldn't be allowed to say, no, they've got to have this treatment. I'm in charge. You've got to listen to me. Because that's an ethical decision as well as a medical decision. And nurses, while they haven't been to medical school for the extent as that doctors have, they have certainly acquired the same ethical skills, if anything better. So nurses can make a significant and worthwhile contribution to ensuring that patients' true wishes are respected or at least heard. So there we have a kind of nuanced view that takes, that kind of agrees with a lot of what Newton says, but at the same time argues that there isn't a kind of autonomy for nursing. So essentially, the key role of nurses, according to Breier, is advocating for patients. Now, in the last reading, Pavlish, Ho, and Rounkle, they argue that advocating for patients in particular settings can require more than just saying, just arguing on a one-to-one basis for individuals. Nurses as a profession and nurses in general should become human rights advocates. Now, this is a bold claim. This makes it sound like, nurses have enough on their plate, you might say. Nursing is a hard enough job, and now Pavlish, Ho, and Rounkle are saying you've got to be human rights advocates as well. But what they argue is that you cannot carry out the mission of patient advocacy without advocating for the human rights, particularly if you're talking about a population like refugees. Now, you might say, well, what does that have to do with me if I'm planning to become a nurse in an American hospital? Well, a lot of your patients will be poor. A lot of your patients will be uninsured. There will be people who are homeless. There will be people from minority groups who have faced oppression. There might be undocumented patients. You're going to come across patients from all kinds of disadvantaged groups. And as part of your role of advocating for your patients, you, the prospective nurse, say Pavlish and Rounkle, you've got to advocate for their rights. So, to give an current example, I think Pavlish and Rounkle would say that nurses should take a side in the Black Lives Matter marches, and they should be taking part in the marches because that is patient advocacy, advocacy for equality, advocacy for defense of human rights and things like that. Let's look at their argument, or let's look at what they say, because unlike, I found, as I said, as a philosopher, the Newton article the easiest one to deal with, because she makes an argument and she spells it out, and whether or not I agree with it, there's an argument there for me to sink my teeth into. Whereas Pavlish and Rounkle, they present a study, they bring in all these other authors that agree with, that make certain claims, and they don't really present an argument in the same way. So I find it harder, just because of my background, to sink my teeth into it. But let's look at some of the things they say. They start by pointing out that the International Council of Nurses Code of Ethics now, and notice that their article is the most recent of the three. I think it was 2012, of the four that we looked at. Let's see, where is it? Yes, 2012. So things have changed since the 70s, and the International Council of Nurses Code of Ethics says nurses should promote an environment in which human rights, values, customs, and spiritual beliefs of the individual, family, and community are respected. So it's right there in the Code of Ethics, human rights. The American, and it's not just the International Council of Nurses, the American Nurses Association Code of Ethics says nurses should become aware of broader health concerns such as world hunger, environmental pollution, lack of access to health care, because you're uninsured, for example, violation of human rights, and inequitable distribution of nursing and healthcare resources. This is something nurses should care for. Nurses as carers, which is what even Newton, the traditional nursing role advocate, was arguing for. Now the American Nurses Code of Ethics say this requires you to basically advocate for the rights of the people that you could care for. Okay, so human rights, what are they? Well, they can be divided into first generation and second generation. The first generation are what we traditionally think of as like Bill of Rights rights, and they tend to be viewed as restrictions, that is, things that other people and the government can't do to you. So they're sort of protections from people doing stuff to you. That's the first generation. So they preserve freedom from degrading treatment and arbitrary detention. That's something the government is not allowed to do to you. Freedom of speech. People are not allowed to prevent you expressing yourself. You can't be censored. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be given something. That doesn't mean that you have to be provided with a computer or a loudspeaker by the government so that you can spread your views. So, for example, some people say, hey, Twitter banned me. That's a violation of my freedom of speech. No, it isn't, because Twitter is a private organization and it doesn't have to let you use its platform. But you're still perfectly free to express your opinion. You just can't do it on their venue. But, you know, nobody is imprisoning you or taping your mouth shut. You're perfectly free to express yourself. So all of these things, all of the first generation are kind of negative. They're just preventing you. They're things that protect you from incursion. And freedom of religion is the same. That is, people can't stop you practicing your religion, but that doesn't mean you should be provided with your own church or something. No, if you've got to find a church, and if there isn't one, you've got to build it. The government doesn't have to provide something for you. The second generation of human rights are more what are called positive rights. That is, in protecting those kind of rights, the government has to literally do something for you. So the second generation are obligations to provide access to education, for example, an adequate living standard, like there has to be sewage systems, and your environment can't be polluted by big business. And you have to have access to healthcare, which in most developed nations includes socialized medicine, essentially publicly provided healthcare, like in the country I'm from, the National Health Service. I probably mentioned this before, but when you go to a health clinic in England, there's no place to pay. There's no place where they check your insurance. You just go in, you wait, and then you see the doctor and you leave. You don't have to check out and show them your insurance card or anything like that. There's none of that, because it's provided for by the government. Now, are there waiting lists? Sure. My dad, for example, he just has been experiencing heart issues, and he just got an appointment to have his heart inspected. But sometimes there can be wait for that. I mean, he's in his late 70s, and sometimes they're of a lower priority. But he's got to see them, and if he went into the hospital and they tested him and it was urgent, then they would do surgery on him then and there. They wouldn't say, "I'm sorry, it's not your turn, you've got to die." So that's the kind of thing that I grew up with. And people who grow up with that kind of healthcare system are scared of traveling to countries like the United States. We literally, when my parents visit, they're kind of anxious. They know that they can't get sick here because it won't be provided for in the same way that it is provided for in the United Kingdom. So everybody who's given the NHS loves it. It is hugely popular in Britain. Anyway, and that is part of, the government saw that as part of an obligation that it had to provide healthcare to its citizens. And that's been in place since basically shortly after World War II. Okay, so there are the human rights, first generation and second generation. How will these rights get realized, particularly in impoverished environments like the Rwandan camp for refugees? That's the question. And that's something that nurses need to be a part of. Historically, I'm quoting on page 719, historically nurse advocacy has been most closely associated with supporting individual patients' autonomy and protecting their right to self-determination. That's what Breier was arguing for. The current advocacy literature also emphasizes patient autonomy. But 720, rarely has advocacy been studied from patient, family, or community perspectives. That is, nurses have been told to advocate for their patients. Now we need to ask the patients, okay, what do you want the nurses to do for you? If the nurses are to advocate for you, what do you want them to advocate? How do you want them to speak for you? And this is what this study is supposed to check. So in other words, they went to these refugees and they say nurses are advocates for patients and advocates for your well-being. What do you want from them? What do you want them to be going out and fighting for you? They're supposed to fight for you. They're supposed to look to your interests. What do you want them to do? That's what this study studied. And so scant attention to advocacy before beyond what one can do for individual patients is evidence. Therefore, in an effort to contribute to research on nurse advocacy, we, the authors of the article, apply findings from our human rights research to develop deeper and more expansive understandings about the meaning of health and human rights advocacy that extends beyond the individual patient to attend to systemic issues. So in other words, what they argue is, look, you can't just focus on individuals, particularly in cases where their lives are oppressed in various ways or placed under various stresses because of institutional disadvantage. If you are going to advocate for your patient, you can't just say, oh, we got to fix that wound. It's like, think of someone who has a drug overdose. You bring them into the hospital. The first thing you got to do is obviously revive them. I've forgotten the name of the drug that is the new miracle drug for people who are having opioid overdoses, but it's amazing. People who would have died before, if they're given this drug, will survive. And now police are supposed to carry it, and EMT nurses are supposed to carry it. EMT professionals are supposed to carry this and they can save people who are overdosing. Now, should a nurse's advocacy role just be ensuring that the person having the OD gets this drug? And then you say, okay, we saved you, on you go. That would be kind of pointless and self-defeating, because if they're an addict, they're just going to do it again. So what you got to do is you've got to change their way of living. You've got to ensure, to advocate for them, you have to try and ensure that they live differently. You have to try and get them into rehab or whatever. Suppose you find out that the reason they're addicted is because their neighborhood is overrun with these drugs, and that suppose, for example, you find that they're a sex slave, that they've been trafficked, and that they're given drugs to keep them loyal to their pimp, as sadly is a very common occurrence. What do you do then? Your role of advocacy is to try and ensure that that people are no longer put into these positions where they are addicted to drugs and controlled in this way. That's the only way to seriously advocate for the health of your patient, is to try and remove them from their oppressive circumstance. You've got to try and protect their human rights. That's what this article is suggesting. Refugees' perspectives on human rights facilitators and system issues provides a strong foundation for nurse advocacy. Nurses can be important spokespersons to support vulnerable populations such as refugee women and girls as they struggle for equal access to health, education, and development opportunities. One of the number one thing that the refugee women and girls wanted was to be protected from child marriage, because child marriage is going to ensure that they are constantly pregnant, that they are abused, that they are beaten, and of course that's going to be poor health outcomes for them. But how do you prevent them from having poor health outcomes? You remove them from a situation where they're subjected to child marriage. So in protecting their health, you have to protect their rights and not be subjected to this discriminatory custom. So research participants supported a dual role of advocacy, protecting not only individual rights, but also advancing policies and practices that create contextual and systemic conditions to support patients to realize their own rights. You've got to advocate for women's rights in developing countries. So you've got to ensure that they are not married off as children, that they have rights of divorce, that they have rights of autonomy, that they have rights to drive, that they have rights to control. You know, that you're supposed to advocate for patient autonomy. Well, this is what it requires. Nurses have been taught to view the advocacy role as for individuals, your individual patients. But chiding all healthcare professionals to extend their bioethics agenda beyond dyadic relationships between healthcare providers and patients. That's what Breier argues for. Daniels, this is someone they're quoting in their article, claimed that bioethics had been myopic, short-sighted, not seeing and not addressing the context in which these relationships operate. It's as if, a woman keeps coming in with bruises and she keeps saying, I fell down again, or the door hit me, and you think, well, we've got to treat your bruises. You're really unlucky, and not making the obvious connection, this person is abused, they're being battered, they're not falling down, they're being hit, and we've got to get them out of that circumstance. If you just focus on their particular current needs, you're not going to improve their life. You've got to look at the broader context and fight for their rights. That's what they're arguing. And so they summarize, since the Florence Nightingale, as I said, was seen in Britain as the mother of nursing. She lived from 1820 to 1910. And Lillian Wald, who's basically a Florence Nightingale figure in America slightly later, who argued for nursing as a distinctive role. She lived from 1867 to 1940. The Nightingale and Wald legacies of collaborating within systems to advance human rights and improve the social and economic conditions of vulnerable populations require resurrection in this time of expanding global health disparities. So that's interesting. What Pavlish, Ho, and Rounkle are saying is, actually, if you look back to the origins of nursing, you see the sort of founders of nursing, Florence Nightingale and Lillian Wald, as radical. They're arguing that nurses have a mission to go out into the world and protect people. And she's saying we should go back to that original goal. And we've become too focused on just working in institutional settings and just trying to save particular patients or advocate for particular patients. We should be more about changing the world. Nurses should be making a better world. And this is the only true way to advocate for patient autonomy and for patient health. Otherwise, you're just going to be putting on band-aids in a system that is the problem. The system is going to be repeatedly producing patients for you because it oppresses them. Whereas if you really want to solve problems, you have to broaden your goal. And nurses should understand that they have power. Nurses, I think Pavlish, Ho, and Rounkle, what the biggest problem they would have with the advocates of traditional nursing is this idea that nurses should be subservient, because that makes you sort of narrow your focus. Oh, I'm just an assistant. I can't have big goals. I'm just supposed to do what other people tell me. And what they're saying is, no, nursing is its own thing. Nursing has its own distinctive mission, and we should take that mission to its logical extension, and it includes advocating in the world for human rights. And that's far from being sort of an add-on to nursing or something that nurses should treat as secondary. That's the primary, that's the core of nursing. And only by pursuing this core can you fulfill the goal of nursing, which is to protect patients. Nurse advocacy at all levels requires a contextual view of health. Look at health as one aspect of people's lived experience, and not as all that you focus on, but as something that arises from their life in the world. And their life in the world is affected by oppressive institutions, and they need their human rights protected. Widening advocacy to include an assessment of human rights obstacles that interfere with health, like child marriage or partner abuse, increases the probability of addressing root causes of ill health, such as human rights violation. If you're going to defend people's health, you've got to look at their human rights. Okay, I think that's a good note to finish the semester on. I hope you've got something out of it.